G'day and welcome to another episode of Create Expectations. Tom Kennedy here, bringing you a very special edition of our Introduce Yourself series. This time featuring Rob Dimery, General Editor of the epic 1001 Albums You Must Hear Before You Die. Rob's just released a new book called MusicQuake, The Most Disruptive Moments in Music, and we had a great chat about this new project, as well as his very famous older project, and some select albums from both of those books. Rob shares why David Bowie's Aladdin Sane is the best album to introduce himself to listeners, and we go on a journey into the chaotic tour life which birthed that album. His new book charts moments which shifted the tectonic plates of the music industry, and we dig a little deeper into two albums which did just that. First, the astounding Kind of Blue from Miles Davis and the process behind its spontaneous composition, as well as Kraftwerk's Autobahn and its influence on everything from hip-hop to dance. As for 1001 Albums, you might be surprised by his pick. We unpack the 2010 pop odyssey, Janelle Monae's Archandroid. Rob also poses plenty of interesting questions about key moments in musical history and has a stab at what might be the next big shake-up in the industry. A massive thanks to Rob, who was incredibly generous with his time, and to Lewis from Cordo Publishing for reaching out to us and setting up the interview. If you enjoy what we're doing here at Create Expectations, be sure to send that message to the algorithm by liking, subscribing, and leaving a rating. But enough of that. Here is Introduce Yourself with Rob Dimery. Rob, welcome to the show and thank you for joining us. Firstly, congratulations on the new book, MusicQuake, The Most Disruptive Moments in Music. What can you tell us about the most disruptive moments in music?
Well, thanks for having me, Tom, first of all. My approach to this book was basically to look at those points in popular culture where there was a shift, and it might have been recognised at the time, or it might only have been recognised afterwards. But the way we think of music and what you can do with music changed in some subtle way. So I opened the book with the premiere of The Rite of Spring, Stravinsky score for a ballet that was debuted in Paris in 1913, and it caused a scandal, as we know. It caused a massive scandal, and there are a whole load of reasons why it may have done that. But the core of it is his music, which was very confrontational. It wasn't what people expected. It started off with a very strained kind of motif on a bassoon. The player is expected to play at the top of his range. It's an effort, and you can hear that, because it's meant to introduce this idea of this is a pagan, primal, heathen kind of a world, and the whole idea of the Rite of Spring is a young girl is dancing herself to death to appease the gods, to make sure they have a good spring, a good crop, that the community can survive. So it's really confrontational, and very soon in the first part of the Rite of Spring, you get this incredible percussive section that just goes sort of bum 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 bum, and there's a real syncopation to it, and it catches you off guard. And there's other similar things where he takes one chord later on and he piles another chord on top of that, and they jar. They're meant to jar because it's meant to say this isn't your civilized late 19th century, early 20th century world. This is a very different world. This is a very savage world, and the music can't be sweet and classical and linear and predictable. This has got to take you by surprise. So that's my starting point, what Stravinsky did there. I go up to much more modern, obviously more modern releases like Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly, which in its own way is challenging and playing with the conventions of hip hop and pushing them forward and pushing the envelope, as it were. And so there's quite a lot of ground in the middle of that, obviously. But I'm looking in just to sum it up, really, I'm looking at points where things altered. There was a subtle shift in the landscape, in the tectonic plates of music, if you like. Sometimes it's classical, sometimes it's jazz. We'll go on to talk about a massive Miles Davis album in that context later on. Sometimes it's avant-garde. You could call it classical, but avant-garde music like the most famous example that I've included in the book, John Cage's 4 minutes, 33 seconds. And that is, you could say it's not music.
It's challenging.
You could literally, you could say it's challenging. You could say it's not music. And it's so interesting. When you know about John Cage's 4 minutes, 33, you can say, well, anybody could have done that. A child could have done that, but nobody did it before he did it. Nobody had the nous to think, okay, what about if I just fill a room with silence, 4 minutes, 33 seconds? How are people going to take that? And on one level, because John Cage was a bit of a prankster, very intelligent man, but a bit of a prankster as well, it could be a joke. Is that just it? And I think that's something that happens. I discovered a lot when I was writing the book. People think, is this music? Do you call this music? You know, that comes up again and again and again, these disruptive moments that I refer to in the book. And of course, John Cage was absolutely serious. He knew the effect it was going to have, I think, but he was absolutely serious because what he was saying was there's never silence. There's never, ever silence. Even if it's just you in a room, your body's making sounds. You've got a heartbeat, you're breathing. That's a sound. And he's reconfiguring your idea of what constitutes sound and silence and music. And he's saying to you, if you listen to it in a certain way, in the right way, if you're broad-minded enough, anything can be music. Anything can be music. And that in turn feeds into something else that I talk about a lot in MusicQuake, which is that people taking found sounds in the world outside and manipulating them in some way, whether that's people like Pierre Schaeffer in Paris in the 40s, working in a sort of like a studio to sort of, you know, manipulate tape, or whether it's Kraftwerk in the 70s with the Autobahn album. You know, they're altering it and they're saying, okay, there's this sound around it. I can make that into a song. I can make that a soundscape.
By its very nature, you know, a lot of art is quite disruptive. How did you manage to narrow it down to 50 moments that were important enough to place in the book?
Well, that's a very good question, Tom. I could have chosen 50 different ones. I could have gone further back. I could have gone back into the 19th century and looked at what people like Debussy were doing and how they'd taken inspiration from the East, from Japanese music. I could have gone in all sorts of different directions. I think what I was after, first and foremost, is a good spread. I didn't want to just concentrate on one style particularly, or, you know, one period particularly. I mean, I've got a big soft spot for psychedelia. I could have done 5 or 6 entries on just 1967, you know, Sgt. Pepper and Velvet's first album, and so I could have just done that. But I was trying to be fairly representative. And I suppose part of that was saying to people, look, okay, you might come to this book and you might like rock and pop, or you might like your hip hop, but I can show you, if you're broad-minded enough, I can show you something in classical music or jazz that's going to turn your head as well. And my approach was, I don't want to concertina too many entries into, you know, 2 or 3 or 5 years. I want to spread through the book to show you, give you a broad overview of how things change. And I want to dip into as many different genres as I can. And I want to show you why they've each got worth. And I also want to show you how these things dovetail, how something in one genre can actually have an effect in another genre.
Yeah, you've done a fantastic job of, as you said, really broad across multiple genres, but also capturing sort of the action reaction of art and history. You know, at the start of each section, you sort of lay out significant moments in history that sort of set the scene for the next chapter or the next section that you're going to talk about. What do you think are some of the more, I guess, explosive eras in history that have caused that action reaction?
Well, I think you could talk about there are 5, just for people who haven't seen the book. There are 5 chapters, as you say. Each one has an introductory section just to give a bit of historical context, and there's a timeline as well. I think the first chapter, when you're dealing with the First World War, when all of the certainties that the things that we took for granted, the society took for granted at the time, they didn't really hang together anymore. You've got towards the end of the 19th century, the outbreak of anarchism, bombings. You've got in the sciences, you've got people like Freud and Jung changing the idea of what's going on in our own heads. And you've got, in response to the First World War, artistic movements like Dada saying, well, look, this is, if civilized society has led us to this massive conflagration with millions of people died, then stuff civilized society. I'm going to give you craziness. I'm going to give you nonsense. I'm going to give you the absurd, which of course feeds into surrealism later. He's saying, I'm going to treat that with the contempt I think it deserves. And it's interesting, actually, the way that these, you get the sort of in the 20s, you get in a slightly different way. You get people saying, well, let's just be hedonistic. Look what we've just lived through. You get that era of the bright young things in the 20s. I think that's obviously a pivotal thing. You could look at something like, also a bit later on in the book, I mentioned when Kennedy's assassinated. That must have been another time, I would imagine. If you were an American at the time, you must have thought, well, what's happening to the world? Yeah. They just got out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that could have been Armageddon. And now somebody's killed their president. And who's killed the president? And why would they kill the president? And what's going on here? All of those certainties of where you stood in the world have been just torn apart. And I think in a very small way, possibly one of the reasons that, so Kennedy's assassinated in 63, in November 63, and in 64, very early in 64, the Beatles come over to America. Okay. Now, I don't want to make too much of this, but I'm positive that they provided a shot of positivity and optimism at a time when a country was shocked and in mourning. And for the youth of America to see the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show and to hear that vibrant music that they were pumping out and to just look at them and look at them and look at what other people looked like at the time in pop and realize that this was something different. This was this kind of like a four-headed beast in pop that was going to, it was so different and it affected so many different people in so many different ways. I think that might have played a part. I think the fact that America had just come through a very traumatic period may have played a part in the success of the Beatles in some tangential way. Wow, that's not in the book, but that's a very interesting observation. Yeah, but I think it's. I mean, in other contexts, I think it's fairly. There are more obvious links you could point out, like in Britain in the 70s. I have to say it feels a bit like we're entering the 70s in Britain here again with the sort of the various crises we're trying to sort of juggle with at the moment. But you've got a social breakdown in the 70s. You've got people going on strike. Rubbish piling up, bodies not being buried. I mean, it sounds fairly apocalyptic. And you've got a great inequality. You've got within society the rise of racism and the National Front over here. Punk happens. You can see how that set is almost like a scientific experiment. You put all of that to boil on the stove, and woof, you get punk. Yeah, I think there's a reason we're getting some really good punk music at the moment off the back of a global pandemic. You're seeing, particularly in Australia, seeing some really angry but vibrant music at the same time. Some amazing punk bands getting around in Australia at the moment. Can you give me some names? Could you give me one or two names that you'd... The Chats, if you want something that's irreverent, I would say the Chats. They're a bunch of 20-something-year-olds from near where I live who are doing a lot of touring at the moment. They just released an album and they are, irreverent is the word I would use.
Amel and the Sniffers. They're more a pub rock band, but they've got a real punk ethos, and they've got a female lead singer who is as close to Bon Scott as you'll ever see.
Wow.
Yeah. So
thanks for the names.
No worries. Hope you like them. I want to jump back a bit. I guess any band that you see now that's really at the top of their game, they've spent a lot of time cutting their teeth, jamming in their bedroom or in the school band. I presume you had a similar journey as a music writer and journalist, cutting your teeth as an apprentice and going and seeing gigs and honing your craft. What's been your journey to this moment in time where you're the general editor of 1001 albums, you've released this new book, and you've made a life, being a music journalist?
Well, in terms of music, I started out when I was at school. I was in sort of various bands, which when you say you're in a band, you're not really in a band. It's just you and a couple of your friends in someone's bedroom.
Yeah.
Half-heartedly, not half-heartedly, but amateurishly playing the 2 or 3 chords together, or trying to do, start doing cover versions or something like that. But I went on from there I went to art school, which is almost like a requisite if you're in a band. And I formed another band there. Originally I was in a punkier band called Ha Ha Ha. And we did a single. We made a single ourselves, paid for the production, and it wasn't that expensive. But off the back of that, we got signed to a label called Cherry Red.
Yep, I know Cherry Red.
Which is a fine label. And
got a couple of Dead Kennedys albums with that sticker on.
Yes, well, one of the nice things about being on a label is that they used to send you freebies every now and then. So I got fresh fruit for rotting vegetables. I think they sent me that. They sent me, oh God, what else did they send me? They sent me some really, really decent stuff, basically, and that was great. That was my introduction to the Dead Kennedys, and I didn't realize how clever they were and how fun that there was a sly wit going on, as well as all this the Ramalam, and the shock value, that there was a real art to what they were doing. Loved that. Anyway, I was in a band. The band became known as Rosemary's Children. We were kind of like an 80s jingle jangle pop band, and we released a couple of singles. I was with them, and I wrote the songs and loved it. Actually, I thought it was the life. I really did. And then for various reasons, we folded, and I just went off, and I suppose I got myself an education and learned how to write. I went to college. I read a lot of books. I bought a lot of books that I never read. And then but I was in London, and I was, constantly going to gigs and what have you, and reading about, And reading about music, reading music books, and to me, the best music books were always the ones, it's a bit of a cliche, I know, but they drove you back to the music, that's when I started sort of getting a taste, I suppose, for doing bits of writing. And fast forward a little bit, I became an editor, stroke writer in the 90s. I started off in children's book writing.
Okay.
Children's book publishing, rather, as an editing. And then in the early 2000s, or mid-2005, we released 1001 albums you must hear before you die. And I did that with a company called Quarto over here. And the process for that was that I worked very closely with the art director, who is a fantastic guy called Tristan. And we just batted ideas back and forth between ourselves. I had the lion's share of the choice, and I would kind of veto or accept, suggestions that we came up together with. And then we managed to recruit some sterling writers from not just the UK. We went to quite great lengths to get people from abroad as well. You know, not just America either, but Europe to Australia, I think, as well. And we wanted to try and put together it's a bit like when I was doing the MusicQuake book that we referred to earlier. You're trying to be quite representative. You're saying most people are going to buy this, are going to be interested in rock and pop, broad as those categories are. We're going to give you some jazz. We'll give you some soundtracks. We'll give you, you know, some off-the-wall stuff as well to just try and mix it up a little bit. And again, you know, they're not all ground-shaking releases by any means, but they've all got something. They're all doing something different. They've all got something worth exploring, I think. I'd choose a different 1001, or maybe I'd choose, you know, 900 of them would be the same, but the last 101 would be different. And if I did it now, and we do still update the book's done. I'm impressed. I'm very gratified by what's happened to the book. It's rather. I mentioned this to you before in chat, but it's rather like releasing an album. You know, you put it out there, and then it's up to the world what the world thinks of it. You know, you're hands off then. And the fact that it's had a long afterlife, that it's still going through reprints and new editions, is hugely gratifying. And what we tend to do with the new editions is, purely for production costs, we can't just shake the whole book up and you know, take loads of stuff out and put loads of stuff in. It tends to be limited to the last few folios of the book, so the last 16 pages or so. You know, we tend to sort of fiddle around with those a lot, but the bulk of the book is the same as the book that came out in 2005, and it's hugely gratifying to me that people are still finding mileage in it. You know,
that's brilliant. That's brilliant. Well, why don't we jump into your first album pick? So one of the things we do on this show is, you know, we're all record collectors, the guys I host the show with, and so we love talking about our record collections. And one of the things we talk about is a record to introduce yourself. I think you've got a pretty interesting choice. I'm keen to understand the rationale behind this, but what is your record to introduce yourself?
Well, my record is Aladdin, Sane, 1973 album by David Bowie. I suppose this is partly to introduce myself, because I wrote a book that came out last year, which was a biography of David Bowie. It was called Lives of the Musicians, David Bowie, part of the series about groundbreaking musicians. And I liked Bowie. Bowie's one of those people who I think, you know, even if you're not a hardcore fan, he did so much. You're going to know you're not going to know about him. But in writing that book, all sorts of new areas of interest about him occurred to me. I read and researched a lot, and I just found him endlessly interesting. I didn't realize I had a greater appreciation of what he was all about. Let's just say that. And I find Aladdin Sane a very interesting album, because the one that gets the kudos, of course, is Ziggy Stardust, and which is a great album in its own right. But that's it's a very focused album, and there's clearly a very, very accomplished songcraft at work there. He really had come into his own as a songwriter with that album after years and years of sort of trying to find his place in music. And in many ways, Aladdin Sane is a scrappier affair. It's quite, he wrote most of it when they were touring Ziggy in the States. Yeah. And as they toured Ziggy in the States, things got kind of messier and messier and madder and madder. And I think obviously he was beginning to indulge, shall we say, quite a lot in various ways. And he'd had this ridiculous success over here as Ziggy, and people had started to identify him as Ziggy. Yeah. This thing that we all know about Bowie, that he in his pomp in the 70s, he adopted a series of different alter egos for various reasons, not least to kind of reinvent himself creatively and to sort of, try a different musical approach for a new album, what have you. But in a way, it almost backfired from the start, because people thought of him as Ziggy and had started to mess with his mind, I think. And you can hear that playing out on Aladdin Sane. I think it was recorded quite quickly. You get the feeling that I think maybe the mixing was a bit rushed. The playing here, I mean, it's the band, which is his Ziggy band with, Mick Ronson on guitar, Trevor Bolder on bass. It's a great band. But there's a slight, things are getting a bit out of hand here. And I think that reflects his experience of America. There's a rushed quality to it. Things are slightly skittery. There's a nervousness about it, which again, I think that fits very well with where he was at the time. I think that's a reflection of his mindset, that he was, you fast forward to the year after, and there's a very famous documentary, which I think Alan Yentob did for the BBC, called Cracked Actor, which is named after one of the tracks on this album. And that's Bowie in the States doing his, I think it's his Diamond Dogs tour, but he's on the way to doing Young Americans in the following year. And, he's being filmed in limos. He wouldn't fly. He had this thing about not flying. He didn't like flying. So he crossed the States in a car, and he's driving through the desert in the States. And he's being interviewed all the time. And he's a bit twitchy. He's a bit sort of, he's a bit cokey. Yeah. And this album, Aladdin Sane, is on it's in that zone. It really is. You've got incredible songs like Cracked Actor, which is such a raw song. The opening few seconds of that, it's Mick Ronson's Les Paul. It's just so dirty. It's a wonderful thing. And the song's dirty. It's a very dirty song about an old actor who's, paying some young thing to sort of, pleasure him. And it's not only the lyrics on this album, it's the way the music sounds. They complement each other perfectly in that respect. So this is a fantastic album where things are starting to get a little bit hairy. He's quite apocalyptic in his outlook at this time. And on the album itself, you've got this, the title track, Aladdin Sane, it's got this weird subtitle that goes 1913-1938-? And he's basically saying the year before World War I, the year before World War II, what's the next one going to be?
What happened? Yeah.
You'll make it, we'll love Aladdin Sane. Battle cries and champagne, just in time for sunrise. We'll love Aladdin Sane.
And obviously the title of the album, he was pretty aware of the state he was in, I guess, and the edge that he'd created for his art.
Yeah, I think so. I think he, in the album cover itself, you've got, it's the most famous version of Bowie, I suppose you could say, the one we think of when we think of him, the zigzag bolt down his face. And I think that's got all sorts of possible connotations, one of which must be split personality, must be kind of schizophrenia or, some fracturing, some mental fracturing. I think it also riffs off the Elvis Presley used to have this TCB sign. It's like a zigzag bolt, basically.
Okay. Yeah.
Not dissimilar to the one down Bowie's face on the album cover. And it was TCB, which was short for taking care of business. And he had it on his plane, and he had it on rings he used to give to his entourage. So I think that's probably in there as well. But yeah, I think he really did. I think it's almost like in plain view, as it were, a lad insane, a man insane. Experience.
It's not particularly veiled, is it?
It's not. It's not. And I think it's interesting because he tried so hard to be a success in the 60s, and he always missed the boat. A bit like Rod Stewart, or Mark Bolan for that matter.
Which is really interesting when you consider these days you would I mean, aside from being someone who's so great at reinventing themselves, you would consider him a bit of a trendsetter for what was to come in the 70s and the 80s. And, he was almost seemed, once he took off, he was always ahead of the curve.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, maybe I think he struggled to find himself, to find his voice. I don't think he thought of himself as a natural musician.
That's amazing.
I think there's he had when he'd made it in the mid-70s, he was doing some gigs in America, and Nina Simone came to one of them. I think it might have been a Madison Square Garden gig with her daughter. And she went backstage afterwards and they got chatting and exchanged phone numbers. And he started phoning her in the middle of the night. And they'd have these long rambling chats. And he didn't know her. There was no history between the two of them. But he gave her, oddly, a whole load of support at a time when she really needed it, because she was a fervent civil rights activist at the time, and she was getting a lot of flack because of that from the government. I think she felt under a lot of pressure in the States. I think Inland Revenue was on her back as well over there. And so there must have been a lot of self-doubt, even for someone as apparently bolshy as Nina Simone. And he would phone her and he would say, the thing is, you're a genius. You're an absolute genius at what you do. I can't do what you do, he said. He gave a total affirmation. He said, I'm not naturally gifted. I work at it. I look at what other people do and I study them and I copy them and I fake it till I make it, basically.
If Bowie has that sort of self-doubt, what hope do any of us have?
Well, I think, but the thing is, I think that was the making of him in a way, because he tried on all these different hats. And in the 60s, which we tend to regard of in terms of his career as sort of a series of false starts. He's in a blues band or an R&B band. He's a bit of a folky. He takes a left field and does some sort of Anthony Newley style. His first album is a very strange album. It's almost easy listening, but it's not quite easy listening. It's him. It's definitely him trying on different voices and different personas. And then towards the end of the 60s, obviously he has a hit with Space Oddity, which actually could have completely derailed his career, because it's a novelty hit. It's a novelty record, tied in with the moon landing. And in a way, I mean, who comes back from a novelty record to become a cutting edge artist who changed the face of music? Doesn't happen very often. Didn't happen to the Smurfs, did it? But with him, I think he found himself by copying other people. I really do. I mean, we mentioned Ziggy earlier. Ziggy is an amalgam of all sorts of different people that he'd met, as well as, whatever originality he brought to the party himself. Iggy Pop is in Ziggy Stardust, Yeah. I mean, Iggy is in Ziggy, quite literally.
Yeah.
A guy he met called Vince Taylor, who was this famous, who did, that track Brand New Cadillac?
Yep.
It's on the Clash's London Calling album, I think, which is a lovely piece of rockabilly. Well, he met up with him in London, and Vince Taylor had a very interesting career. But basically, at the end, he became a bit of an acid casualty, and Bowie met him and had a big chat with him in Soho about this and that. And then, and off the back of their meeting, that fed into it as well, because Vince Taylor, crashed and burned. And that's part of the story of Ziggy Stardust, of course. But so in Aladdin Sane, in a way, you've almost got like the sort of the afterlife of Ziggy Stardust in the sense that, I'm showing you what happens on the way down.
Yeah. It was the next iteration of his career, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think he's, but it ends. I mean, what's so one of the other things I love about this album is that he's already looking at ways to move on from what he's done, and he employs Mike Garson, and Mike Garson is a brilliant jazz influenced, but also kind of avant-garde pianist, and he's all over this album. He makes this album stand out for me because he's introducing an element It just wasn't there on Ziggy Stardust, or indeed on anything that Bowie had done, or indeed on anything that anybody else was doing in pop music at the time.
Yeah.
There are bits on this album where Mike Garson is playing a solo, and it's almost like Mike Garson is in a different recording studio. There's whatever the band is doing on that track, and then there's what Mike Garson is doing. And it's like he isn't even hearing the track. He's just improvising. And then they just slap what he's done on top of their track, and that's the new track. There's I think it's there in Aladdin, Sane. But also, so there is a madness. There's a sort of, there's on the track Time, there's like a sort of Brecht and Weill kind of sort of lilt that he brings to the track, which is, it's completely different. It actually feeds into Bowie's interest with Jacques Brel as well, I think. There's this kind of, it's sort of like cabaret, dark cabaret in the track Time. But then you've got him on the final track, Lady Grinning Soul, which is absolutely sublime. This album is quite, as I say, it's a mad album. It's got some raucous guitar. It's got some dark thoughts on it. And then right at the end, you get this little patch of calm with Lady Grinning Soul, which is one of the most sublime pieces, one of the most underrated and sublime pieces he ever wrote. And Mike Garson said, I threw in a little bit of Chopin, a little bit of Liszt there. There's these lovely rippling, sun-speckled lines that he sort of produces on the piano, and it's almost like after all you've just been through a storm, a madness. You've just been through a US tour of the States. Yeah, it's mad. Things are falling apart, even though he was making a big name, he was beginning to make a name for himself in the States. He was broke. His management company had thrown so much money into making it look as if he was a star. He went over there on QE2. He would stay in the best hotels. He'd have the best champagne. He had an entourage of nearly 50 people, all of this sort of thing. Things were actually not solid for him at all. And then you get Lady Grinning Soul at the end of this album, as if it's sort of, and breathe. Yeah, and it's like the most beautiful love song. Is it a love song? I don't even know if it is. Maybe it's just a sort of this wonderful, it's almost like a prayer to a woman that he loved or something like that. It's a gorgeous piece of music. So that, Tom, is why I like Aladdin Sane by David Bowie.
Very nice, very nice. You've given us a chart of the whole album. I'm going to have to re-listen to it again now, with new eyes and new ears. So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
I want to jump back into MusicQuake, and I just had a thought, given your extensive experience, both as a musician and as a journalist and a writer, and through the series of books you've written and through all the gigs you've been to in your life. So with these 50 disruptive moments in music history that you've picked for MusicQuake, are any of these items ones that immediately jumped out at you because they had an impact on you, or you witnessed them yourself, or you just knew, I saw that or heard that or read about that at the time? That's got to be in the book.
Well, I don't know. I was slightly too young for punk by about a year or two, by which I mean I was about 9 or 10 when punk hit in the UK. Yeah. I knew that I had to have something by a punk band in there, obviously, because punk's all about disruption, either in a very positive or a nihilistic and negative way. It's all about disruption. And if you're going to have a punk band, I could have had The Clash, I suppose, but for me it was the Sex Pistols. I remember very distinctly when I was a kid. You know how when you're growing up, if you've got slightly older friends, there'll be a shift. So you'll all be into the same things, and then those of you who are maybe just a year or so older, it can make a lot of difference when you're 9 or 10 or 11 or 12. Yeah. And they'll suddenly be into something that you can't quite get because you're not old enough. So they'll have moved on. And I had some friends. I had a buddy. He was my best mate when I was that age. And we'd been into glam rock together just because they look, glam rockers were funny looking people who made good songs you could jump around to when you were very young. And it was great. And I loved a lot a lot of glam rock. But then he started getting into punk, and he would have albums by The Clash and The Damned. I remember the first Damned cover, the cover of the first Damned album. And think, why have they done that? You know, as a little boy, why have they done that? Why do they look like that? Why have they squirted that cream all over the place? And he had 999 albums and XTC, which I thought of as being punk at the time. But he had the single of God Save the Queen by the Pistols, which I should say I've talked about a different Pistols track in it. And it was so other. It was so different. I remember being really struck by that at the time, thinking, what have they done with the Queen's face on the cover of that single? Why have they put a safety pin through her mouth? And it was just, I didn't have any references for that. I had no references for punk at all. And I mean, you know, now that I'm older, you could trace it back to the New York Dolls. You can trace it, you know, the Ramones. You can go back to the MC5 and Iggy and the Stooges. You can go back to garage bands like the Sonics. You can go back to the Stones or the Who, you know, but you don't know that when you're 10 or 11. You just hear punk and you think, but what is that?
Where does that come from?
Yeah, where does that come from? So I knew there had to be punk in it. I wanted there to be British punk in there. I mean, I think that the track I eventually chose for the book was Anarchy in the UK, because I think this was such a different prospect. I mean, punk takes, like any genre, you know, you can have all sorts of punk, and you can have very political punk, or you can have very personal punk, like, I don't know, the Slits, who I also mention in the book. You know, their take on punk is also a feminist take. It's saying, you know, we are being undervalued as women by other punks as much as anybody, as much as society at large, you know. But with Anarchy in the UK, he's bringing politics into pop in a very direct way. He's singing in a way. I mean, who really sang like him? It's almost like an anti singing what he's doing. Or angry, or some kind of weird recitation that he's doing. You know, it was so new, and as I say before, I've used the term before, other. So I knew there had to be punk. And in terms of seismic moments in British punk, certainly it would have to be the Pistols, because people like the Clash weren't the Clash until they saw the Pistols. Joe Strummer was in a band called the 101ers until he saw the Pistols, and then the Clash were, you know, the second pillar of punk, if you like, in many ways.
Yeah.
So that.
I wanna destroy, possibly, 'cause I wanna be anarchy. Now dogs, buddy.
Brilliant. Well, let's have a chat about a couple of albums from the book that you want to talk about from your own collection. Neither of them are punk, but they certainly changed things when they hit the airwaves.
Yes. So the first album I'm going to talk about is Kind of Blue. I'll do it chronologically. If that's correct.
Yep.
And the background to this, it's Miles Davis with some extraordinary sidemen, Cannonball Adderley, John Coltrane. He's got Bill Evans on piano. And Miles Davis had decided that jazz had got too complicated. He'd played hard bop himself. He did an album called Milestones, probably only the year before, and he knew he'd lived through bebop, of course, as well, which is all about the sort of flurries of notes, just extraordinarily complex music, basically. You know, very complicated chord charts, very complicated arrangements, quite difficult to take in at one go.
Yeah, absolutely.
I make the point in the book that I think a lot of this tied in with, in some way, with a sense of black pride, because I think if you'd go back before bebop and you've got things like swing music, or even right back to people like Louis Armstrong, who I also mentioned in the book, his hot fives and hot sevens, it's entertaining music. It's music to dance to. You could admire it, and you can buy records of it and listen to it at home. But it's music to it's music to dance to. Whereas bebop isn't really music to dance to. I mean, you can dance to it, I guess, but it's about listening to and appreciating and understanding what they're doing with these incredible sort of explosive pieces of music. What Charlie Parker is doing, why is he doing what he's doing? What is Thelonious Monk doing when he's doing what he's doing on the piano keyboard? And I think it's part of it was black artists who, of course, in America in the 40s and the 50s, well, and you could say now, but particularly then, were being undervalued and shortchanged by society and discriminated against. And they were basically saying, I've got an art form here that's really, really worth your time. And we dress in a certain way, we look in a certain, we talk in a certain way. And we're refining an art form here, and it's almost for insiders only. You have to work it. If you want to understand what we're doing, you've got to work at it.
Really, yeah, quite. It's like almost like reading an essay when you're looking at listening to some of that stuff.
Yeah, but it's also it's like saying, I take a pride in this. I'm a young black man, and I'm so gifted. I can produce this music, and I take a pride in that. And that, which is wonderful, which is amazing. But it's complicated music. And what Miles Davis was saying with Kind of Blue is, I'm going to just take the heat out of this a little bit. Yeah. It's got too complicated. I want to go back to basics. And the way he went back to basics was he got rid of all this idea about complicated chord charts and arrangements. And he made it as simple as possible. And he took what we refer to as a modal approach, which is basically just scales. If you play on a piano keyboard, if you play from C to C, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, like that, that's a scale. If you started on the next note up, D, and went from D to D, it would sound slightly different. It wouldn't be a major scale. It would be la, 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 la. It would sound slightly odd. That's a different kind of scale, and you'd call it a mode. You could do the same with if you start on E and go up an octave, and F and you go up an octave. Then they've got different qualities to them. And he decided to base this album on modes rather than very, very complicated chord arrangements. And the net result of that is it's a much simpler prospect. It's in many ways much more accessible than bebop. In every way, it's more accessible than bebop. It's also melodic. And there's lots of space in this album. That's all part of the magic of it. You can hear everybody. It's a very democratic album. You can hear the different players giving each other time to speak, to say something, if you like, and then somebody else will step up to the mic and they'll take their turn. It's a wonderful work of collaboration between them. You very rarely get screaming solos on this album. In fact, you never get screaming solos. Some people like John Coltrane will give you a bit more of a flurry of notes, but whenever Miles Davis steps up, his solos are so exquisitely kind of bittersweet, and they're very laid back. They're very understated. Sometimes there's an almost offhand approach. The first track on the album, So What, which sums it up in a way. and very early on in that piece, he hits a slightly bum note. There's a Miles Davis solo, and it's slightly off. He doesn't quite hit it right. But that's okay. And the reason that I think that's okay, the reason why it doesn't matter at all, is because he had tapped into this idea of this kind of first thought, best thought idea. So he'd done a few sketches to show the guys in the band what he was going to do with this album, what he wanted to do. A few very, very basic arrangements, but really nothing. They didn't have time to properly rehearse or anything like that. Yeah. And then they just went into the studio and they did it. And most of what you hear on this album is a first take.
That's astounding.
And this was all part of the ethos, the whole mindset that he had, that he brought to this was, I want it to be spontaneous. I want you to hear the sound of music being composed in real time. improvisation in real time.
It's mind-boggling.
It is mind-boggling, isn't it? And this is something. It comes out. Bill Evans, who's the pianist for most of the tracks, he wrote the liner notes for the album, and he says there's a certain kind of Japanese art where they use a parchment that they stretch, and they have these lovely brushes, and they use painting black paint watercolor with watercolor on the parchment. But the parchment is so taut and so fragile that if you change direction too quickly with the brush, or if you pause, you'll destroy the fabric of the parchment very slightly. You will impair what you do. So what you have to do is you have to be as spontaneous as possible. You have to be as free-flowing and spontaneous as possible. You have to be in control and not in control, if you like. And he was saying, well, this is the ethos that we're trying to bring to this album. This is what you're hearing. You're hearing, as near as damn it, the spontaneous creation of music.
Incredible.
So I think that's the album's in MusicQuake because it's a rejection of what went before, and it opened up a whole new door in jazz in terms of this much more stripped down kind of approach to jazz.
Yeah.
But also because you just don't get many people doing that. I mean, you certainly didn't get many people doing that at the time. It's an extraordinary, you don't prepare in it, or in another way, you don't prepare for the sessions, but in a way, their whole careers had prepared them for those sessions because they were such extraordinary musicians. John Coltrane, Miles Davis, Bill Evans, they were the top of their game. So all of that had prepared them to be able to go into a studio with very little preparation and just to unleash this quiet monster, this quiet revolution of an album.
It's almost mythological. When you speak about it in those terms and what they were able to achieve. But the fact that it's the process and the skill to be able to do what they did is so complicated, but they've made it so accessible. And as a result, I'm sure it's in record collections of people with, mostly metal albums or mostly punk or mostly bluegrass. You'll see a copy of Kind of Blue because it was so accessible. It sort of took jazz to the world again in a new form.
There was I saw a lovely quote from Q-Tip from A Tribe Called Quest, where he said it was a kind of like the Bible. Every home had one.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
And you can see what he means, and it is. But it's. I think this is a theme that I pick up on again and again in MusicQuake. It is revolutionary, but it's accessible as well. It's very melodic. I mean, I've blathered on about modes and scales and, which is true. It underpins the compositions on this album, but they're accessible. So what? It's a lovely little riff. It's cheeky. It's very easy to get it in like that, You can then go on and try and understand why he's doing what he's doing, why they're all doing what they're doing, what the structures of these pieces of music are. But you don't need to do that to appreciate it, which is why it's ended up as one of the best, if not the best selling jazz album of all time. I think timelessness and space, these are qualities that run through this album, and that's why we keep coming back to it, I think.
Why don't we jump into your next MusicQuake piece? We spoke earlier about found sounds. I think this has a fair chunk of those in it, and disruptive is probably the perfect word to describe this when it landed on the shelves.
Yes, so this is skipping forward to 1974 now with the release of Autobahn by Kraftwerk. So Well, where do you begin with this? You can start by looking at what it influenced. It influenced 80s synth pop, influenced Bowie, again, to bring him up again, in his Berlin trilogy, especially Low and Heroes. Brian Eno, who worked with Bowie on those, influenced him greatly. It influences hip hop, bizarrely. The fact that people in the Bronx would get what Kraftwerk were doing and would then recreate that on things like Afrika Bambaata's Planet Rock, that would influence house and techno. Derek May, there's a lovely quote from Derek May, who said that what's techno? Well, techno is basically Kraftwerk and George Clinton stuck in an elevator with nothing to occupy them but a sequencer. And that makes complete sense. So in a sense, it's one of those things that it's a cornerstone of modern dance music, So anyway, Autobahn, where can we go with this? Well, it's the piece itself is originally, it was originally the whole of side one of this vinyl, when the album's on vinyl. You've got the sound of, they're basically taking you on a journey. This is something I like a lot in music, and it happens a lot in the artists I feature in MusicQuake. They've got a sense of fun and play about them. Yeah. I think play is so important in the arts, in any form of art. It's important in life, but it's particularly important in music, I think, when you got an album like this where they say, okay, we're going to pretend, look, we're going to take you on a journey. We're going to go on one of these big, long Autobahns in Germany. I think they were inspired by, they used to do a lot of trips for playing gigs and rehearsing or what have you. They used to travel long distances. They used to go from Cologne to Bonn, I think it was, on the Autobahn. And you've got the sound of car door opening and shutting at the start, and you've got the sound of the car starting up, and the little sort of, I think they do it on a synth, but there's a sound of a little beep, beep, and then they're off. They're off. And then you get this wonderful, mesmerizing 22-minute long track, Autobahn, which is, it's very mesmeric. It's very, it's repetitive without being dull. You can almost see the different landscape outside the car windows as you're traveling with it, because it's the same. It's like, you go on a car, in any car journey, it's the same, but it's different all the time. You're in a car on a road, but the world around you is changing all the time. And you get all of those things. They used field recordings, but they did sampling as well. And they used electronic sound to mimic real world sounds. Like they like to use white noise for the sound of sort of air being injected into tires, that kind of thing. They had like this Doppler effect where as if you got traffic around you and you can hear it sort of like that, but it's all kind of synthesized. Yeah. You've got these weird sort of vocoder treated robotic vocals. And it's a very different prospect from everything else that was going on in 1974, basically. It's also got the album as a whole. I mean, there are a few other tracks on it, such as there's one inspired by a comet that was near that approached the Earth at the time, called Comet and Melody. And this and Autobahn itself tap into the backgrounds of Ralf Hutter and Florian Schneider. I think they were classically trained, and it's almost like they are children in a pop toy shop, and they're trying to find their way with these new things, because they're classically trained. Schneider was a flautist, and he plays flute on the album in bits. but it's almost like, well, we understand instrumental music, but now we're going to try our hand at a bit of vocals, I suppose, and I suppose we have to have riffs because that's what pop musicians do, don't they? Well, we'll put a few riffs in here as well, I suppose. But there is an almost classical mindset to a lot of the stuff that they do. There's a serenity, there's a linear quality, there's a logic to what they're doing. You know, it's a very ordered album in many ways. That's that one, Comet and Melody 2, actually, I think it's called. They've got this, it's like a scale. One of their solos is like a scale. I mean, a scale isn't really a solo. A scale is like an exercise you do. But it's like, oh, what should we do? Well, maybe we should have a scale in here. That would liven things up. So they put a scale in there. And it's a different mindset. It's a radically different mindset. And the whole thing ends with this, the whole album ends with this track, Morgan Spazia Gang, if I hope I pronounced that correctly, which is Morning Walk. And it was inspired by the fact they used to have these intense studio sessions, all-nighters. Yeah. And then they'd come out and you'd have the silence of an early morning around you, and you might hear the birds with the morning dawn chorus and what have you, which they kind of synthesize and they have at the start of this track. And so it's it's a radically different approach to making music. Yeah. And what's as interesting to me about Autobahn and the effect it had, I mean, it was a hit. They edited down the title track to about, a pop-friendly length of about 3.5 minutes or something, and they had a hit in the States. Yeah. It's quite an odd thing, really, because this is a German language album. I was looking, before our chat, I was looking at examples of other things that have been hits from Germany in the States. Yeah. And it's things like, Strangers in the Night, the Sinatra. Strangers in the Night. That one. Well, that was originally written by Bert Kaempfert, who was a German band leader. Okay. But I mean, it's English lyrics, you know what I mean? Yeah. It's easy listening it with English lyrics. This is something much, much more radical than that. It's a very futuristic sound. They're speaking via, the only lyrics in it are "Wir fahren, fahren, fahren auf den Autobahn." They're singing in German. Yeah. So it's very uncommercial prospect, really. Yet it was a hit. Yet it had yet it touched people, as I say, in the Bronx and elsewhere. And they were this album is a prime example of what Kraftwerk how they were trying to build a new music in Germany, in a country that had taken the world into 2 world wars and was still living with the legacy of that. And they didn't want to. They wanted to separate themselves from that legacy. Yeah. Almost by looking back to the time before what happened. Because you look at the famous images of Kraftwerk that we know. They've got short hair. Imagine this in the 70s. This is something I always try and do, Tom. When I write about something, I try and imagine what it must have been like at the time. I try not to read too much background, and I just try and put myself in the place. Okay, if I'm a long-haired rocker in 1974, and I'm into, I don't know, metal, or I'm into rock, or I'm into glam or something like that. And then these guys come on, they got short hair, they're wearing suits. Suits, they've got ties. They look clean cut. They haven't got hairy beards. They're not playing guitars. They're playing synths. And synths at the time were like a joke. Synths were, what was synths? Synths were prog rock. Yeah. But what Kraftwerk's trying to do is they're using synths in a pop context. They're using synths to make pop music. And people weren't doing that. And it's not in a novelty way either. Yeah. They're doing that, and they're trying to, they don't want to pander to Western expectations of what they should all be about. So they don't want to do bluesy rock. Great as a lot of bluesy rock is, they don't want to do that. They're trying to carve out this niche for themselves. It's quite a brave thing that they were trying to do, I think. And they got a lot of flack from it. And the flack that they got, a lot of it was very nasty, xenophobic rubbish, really, from people who should have known better. Yeah. From a lot of music papers. There was a review of one of their gigs around about this time in, I think it was Melody Maker. And it was a very dismissive review. And the title was something like, "This is what your fathers fought to save you from."
I remember that.
This is the 70s,
yeah.
just 30 years after the nearly the end of the Second World War. And they're still banging on about this kind of thing. They won't let it drop. That's the kind of thing they were up against. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so you've got suspicion of them as Germans, suspicion of them as electronic artists, anger from a lot of rock critics who, as I say, don't take them seriously. And they came through all of that and became one of the, I mean, you know, who's had a greater influence on music, the Beatles or Kraftwerk? It's very difficult to say. If you really track it down, you know, there's definitely a before and after Kraftwerk in music. You know, I didn't mention there post-punk bands like Joy Division.
Yeah.
You look at the way Joy Division dress. You know, when they stop being Warsaw, the punk band Warsaw, they start being Joy Division. They're all about the smart suits and ties. And they dress down.
Became New Order, which is very dancey.
Yeah. So, and I think Kraftwerk play a pivotal part as influencing all of that as well. So it's almost like, what didn't they influence when you think about it in pop music? You can hear traces of it all over the place. But so that's one of my other entries in MusicQuake.
Very good, very good. Well, we couldn't have you on without having a quick chat about this book's forebear, which is 1001 Albums. You must hear before you die. We've touched on it a little bit, and I have to admit there's a copy sitting next to my turntable, which is often used as a bit of reference material. If I'm listening to an album, I might flip to that page and have a bit of a read. Or
great.
We've actually done a couple of episodes on the podcast where we've just said, pick an album from the book and let's talk about it. So it's a brilliant piece of reference material. Something as a music fan I absolutely love diving into. You said you update it sort of periodically. How do you actually, let's take a step back. How did you settle on 1001 Albums? And then how do you decide who drops off and who jumps in to the book, as you said, when you release those updates? It must, I mean, I know it's subjective and you've just got to make a decision, but it must be incredibly hard to decide on the initial list and then on who drops out and who comes in. Yeah,
it is. Next question. No, it is. It's really difficult because, I mean, you kind of feel that some stuff has to be in there because if you didn't put it in there, people would say you're just being perverse now.
Right.
You know, why wouldn't you have, I don't know,
Smells Like
Michael Jackson's Off the Wall or the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper, or, you know, you have to, because they had an effect, you know. Yeah. It's an important album. If you imagine, let's imagine this book is aimed at an alien that's just beamed down and wants to know all about music on Earth or pop music on Earth, you know, why wouldn't you have that in there? You have to. But then, of course, it's a really difficult balance to strike, because then you think, well, I want you to hear things that you've never heard before. I want to have your expectations and your conventions challenged.
Yeah.
So you have to make space. You have to carve out space for left field stuff. There's an album by Os Mutantes, their debut album. So they're a Brazilian psychedelic band from the 60s. I can't remember. I think it's 1968 or something like that. And it's bonkers. And that there has to be space for an album like that in there alongside the well-known stuff. So you are constantly balancing up those two expectations, really. It's a bit like what I was saying earlier about radical music that gives you something to hang on to by way of a melody, I suppose. It's like, I want to give you this album by Os Mutantes, which, I mean, the first track alone, it goes on. Then apparently everything stops on the first track of the album. It breaks down, and then they start again. It sounds like they're having a tea break. You can hear cutlery being dropped or teacups. I mean, you think, what the heck? What's going on? Was this an outtake that they just forgot to, get rid of or something? And I want there to be space for that as well as the sweeteners, which is the stuff that everybody knows about and everybody would expect to be in there. I mean, they want you to have a different take, if possible, on some of these big things, but they'd expect them to be in there. So it's a real balancing act. It's a real balancing act. And you asked, I mean, in terms of what we take out, that's very difficult. I mean, it's really, really difficult. It's very difficult anyway to say that something is like a classic album worthy of your attention when it's only been released a year or two, you know?
Yeah.
That's always the updates are always a bit of a leap into the dark, I think. And there are some things that just jump out. I mentioned To Pimp a Butterfly. Well, that's, that's a few years ago now. But when we put that into the book, it was like, well, this is obvious. This is a game changer. Sometimes it's really obvious. Sometimes it's just a best guess. You think, well, this person is saying something different. Whether it's different enough to last the test of time, I don't know. But right now, in the context of what I'm looking at out there in the landscape of pop, it's different enough to warrant being mentioned. I think sometimes we're forced to take out an album that we really love because we've got 2 or 3 other albums by the same artist. And we think, okay, well, of the 3 of them, probably the first 2 are stronger than this last one that we've included. The last one will have to go for us to put something new in.
The album that you chose to chat about for your pick from the book was quite a recent one, which I was interested by. That was 2010. I think. Yeah. I must admit, I knew the single from this album, but I'd never listened to it from start to finish till you sent it through. It's Janelle Monae's The Archandroid. I'm surprised I'd never listened to it because I love a concept album, and this is quite futuristic. It's futuristic and sort of taps back into its roots as well.
Yeah, it is, and it's. I think I chose it partly as it's a nice companion piece to Bowie, because there is this idea with Bowie and Ziggy, this idea of a concept of a like a messianic savior, rock and roll savior, coming to liberate well, in the case of this album, the Archandroid, an oppressed minority from this weird secret society. That's about as much of the concept as I can understand anyway. But you'd have to listen to this album quite a few times and scrutinize the lyrics to actually to go much further with that. I think it's a sci-fi, futuristic kind of sci-fi album. She appears as some kind of a variant of Maria from Metropolis. On the front cover, this kind of robotic android. Bowie borrows from Metropolis a lot with this idea of sort of, this sort of vaguely dystopian future. And it's here as well. It's in the Archandroid. The Archandroid is an amazing album, I think. That sense of play that I talked about earlier. It's almost like somebody's in this extraordinary toy shop. They're hugely talented, a hugely talented artist child in a toy shop. I'm trying to follow this. Bear with me. I'm going to follow this one down. But in a toy, just totally trying out all the toys there, but doing something really clever and interesting with all of them. Yeah. That's what she's doing. I think she was one of Prince's proteges. She had massive respect from people like Big Boy from Outkast. She was signed to Sean Diddy Combs' label, Bad Boy. Okay. It's just got this crazy abundance of ideas. I could have put this in MusicQuake, Is it too late? Going to pull the book back, rip a few pages, stuff this one in at the end. Abundance of ideas. But it's really... when you get a concept album, even if it has got loads and loads of ideas in it, it can be a bit sloppy. Sometimes it can be a bit indulgent. It can go on a bit. It can lose you. This doesn't. For me, this album keeps me totally gripped. She said she thought of it as like it's almost like you're going to see a film. Yeah. She didn't want you to see it. She didn't want you to cherry pick bits from it. She wants you to sit down and experience the whole thing in one go. And if you do, you come out of it and it's like, and breathe. Wow, what have I just been through? You know, it packs a punch. It reminds me, actually, there was something that Taylor Swift was talking about. She, you know, when Taylor Swift was very anti Spotify a few years ago, she said, I grew up on albums as like novels.
Yeah.
I grew up, you know, it's an entire experience that you engage with. And I want you to engage. I don't want you to cherry pick bits from it. I put this album together. I crafted this album. I want you to listen to it as a whole, as the way I gave it to you, because you're going to get something from this that you won't do if you just take the bits that you regard as the best tunes, you know? It's a dazzling album, the Archandroid. It's full of pop hooks. The single was, I think, Tightrope, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The first single. Tightrope is a blinder. It's like, it's a kind of a combination of, I mean, there's James Brown in there, but there's also kind of Missy Elliott in there. Her delivery is so sharp and precise and taut and focused. And when you see live performances of her and her band, that a brilliant band as well, live at the time, they're beautifully just choreographed and performed, and it's like a whole production. It's almost very old-fashioned. It's like almost like going to see a review show or something like that. She really, you know, the look of her, the costumes, her moves, the whole package. It's a real sort of, I am a 21st century all-round entertainer. I'm a total performer. She names her inspirations for each of the tracks on the liner notes. She's very open about, but you don't even have to know that. You can pick them out. You can hear Stevie Wonder here.
Yeah.
But you can hear, as I say, James Brown. You can hear kind of psychedelia. You can hear all sorts of obvious touch points for her, but she never gets bogged down by any of those influences. She does things like there's a track called Neo Gumbo, and it's backwards. This is, oh, geez, God. It's backwards. It's great, but it's backwards. It's just a backwards track. Yeah. And then if you can find it online, go on YouTube, you can find it the right way around. When you listen to the right way around, it's a brilliant track again. It's an amazing track. It's a gorgeous track. Yeah. So it's just like, if you like it backwards, try it forwards. You know, you like that too. And it's an extraordinary track, an album for me, because it's a long album. If you take it, it's 18 tracks, I think, lasts about 70 minutes, something like that. So it's a commitment if you're gonna do it. But it's almost like, again, I bring up the Bowie comparison. It's like she's putting on different voices for each track as well. She's assuming different characters. I think she had like a drama background. Yeah. So she was very comfortable with theatre, and it's a very theatrical performance that she puts across. And she's as Bowie did, or as Lennon did, John Lennon did, for that matter.
As you said, it's almost a movie that you're taking on this journey. Yeah, it is, and it's like a sort of, it's almost. It reminded me in an oblique way of you know, that Avalanche's album Since I Left. Yeah, which is just sample heavy, isn't it? Famously sample heavy. Yeah. But it reminds me of that. It's almost like she sampled 18 different other people, and this is a compilation, because it's so it's so extraordinarily varied. Yeah. This is why one of the reasons you can't take it all in one go, because it knocks you back. It really, you know, you're just getting over one song and then another blinder comes on and you think, my God. So you have to kind of listen to it and listen to it again, really, to fully appreciate what's going on, I think. But it's just so audacious. And I think in that it's one of the most, it's the spirit of pop. It's what pop should do. Pop should give you a hook. Pop, you want to dance to pop. You want to move around to pop. That's what pop does. You want to make it help you to dance all over your troubles. You know, you want that. And at the same time, with a lot of pop, it'll take you a bit further in some ways. It'll say, okay, I can give you that, but
can also give you a lot more.
Yeah.
When you're along for the ride, I can give you this and this and this. I can stretch your expectations. I can give you new sounds. I can make all sorts of exciting connections with pop culture at large and society at large. I can send you off in all sorts of different directions with this. And for me, that's what she does. I mean, it's extraordinary. It's very audacious. It's a debut album.
It's amazing. Yeah. It's so bold for a debut.
Very bold, very bold. And I think she, and also this whole kind of, this concept that she has, that the album's divided into two, what she calls suites. And they're each introduced by this little sort of semi-orchestral overture, as if, again, it's a bit like Pepper, I suppose. It's a bit like, it's almost like the orchestra's warming up, and then woof, we're off. And she kind of does that. But these are actually suites 2 and 3 of a trilogy. And she'd done an EP before this, 3 years before this, which was where she introduced this character of the Archandroid, which she called the character she plays, if you like, is called Cindy Mayweather.
Okay.
That's the android herself, and she introduces her on this EP. So she had a whole conceit, a whole concept, the framework she was working with. Again, very Bowie-esque, very Bowie-esque. But she's working within that sort of framework. But it's interesting because what she's doing, it's not just a riff on Metropolis. It's also got all sorts of ramifications in terms of, I'm giving you a massive statement of self-affirmation. So it's not just about some mythological future race that's being oppressed by a secret society and the Archandroid is going to liberate them. It's about right now here on Earth, people who are feeling that they're oppressed. It's about minorities, people who are marginalized in society. And it's about trying to get across the idea that you can do something about it. It's a strident statement of self-affirmation, I think, in a way, just by saying, look how creative I am. I can beat anyone. You can tamp me down as much as you like. You can backtalk me. You can shoot people like me in the street. We're going to make it. It's a bit like that Kendrick Lamar, All Right, that track, All Right. It's like, whatever you do, we as a whole, we're going to be all right. We're going to make it. We're going to make it. And it's a very uplifting album, I think, in that context.
Yeah, absolutely. You're spot on. It could sit quite comfortably in MusicQuake. There might need to be a reprint at some point. If you could throw things forward to sort of what's coming up in the music industry in that space, or even what's unfolding at the moment, what do you predict, or what do you see now is really causing that next big quake in the music industry?
I think it's tricky. It's tricky. I'll give you that. I wouldn't be surprised if we see, in a way, that the death of the big record companies, or maybe at least the shrinking of the big record companies, and the whole way in which an artist and their listeners, their fans, the nature of that relationship changes. Because I think there have already been quite a few ways in which in which our major artists have tried to engage directly with fans without the need for a record company being in the middle or getting in the way, you could say.
Yeah.
I think for years and years and years, the record industry did very, very well out of artists. For decades, did very well out of artists while overcharging customers for the music that those artists produced. I think that they had a real scare when Napster, which I mentioned Napster in MusicQuake, and the effect that had on the way we consume music. They had a real scare with that. I mean, a lot of artists did as well, of course. Metallica took them to court, but I think it took a long while for the music industry to find its feet again and to work out ultimately that, if they had paid subscriptions, that would be a way to generate money out of streamed music, and then woof, we're okay again, we're off again, it's stabilized. But I wonder how permanent that could be. I wonder if more people start to sort of, like with with Radiohead, with their pay what you like thing. You could say, well, not a lot of younger artists can afford to do that. But I wonder if by talking directly to their fans, bypassing a record company and saying, okay, we will sell directly to you. I mean, Prince looked into this, didn't he? We'll sell directly to you. I'll be the record company and the artist. I mean, in a parallel way, people have been able to record in their bedrooms for decades now, and produce really high quality. They can mix, they can master, they can produce high quality music in their own bedrooms. It's part and parcel of the same thing. It's taking away the need to have a massive studio, the attendant costs and expenses that go with that. And it's making, at its most positive, let's say, it's giving artists, it's liberating artists. It's giving them a suppleness and a freedom to be able to actually do things that they would have had to have gone cap in hand to a record company to have in the past. So I think maybe the sidelining of record companies and a more direct relationship between artists and their fans. I think that would shake up the music industry a lot.
You've got artists like Taylor Swift taking back their rights and re-recording albums the way they want to. And I guess she's an example of someone who's almost bigger than the labels now, so she has the luxury of doing that. But on the other end of the scale, you've got it if I can use another Australian band like King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, who knew from the start that they weren't label or radio friendly, so they just decided to do it themselves. I mean, what label would let a band release 20 albums in 10 years, 3 albums this month, and allow one of those albums to have been piled together from 5 or 6 hour jam sessions every day until they had an album? I mean, it's
exactly. Yeah. I mean, I talked about Prince just then, and one of his big beefs with his label was that they wouldn't let him release as much music as he wanted to when he wanted to release it. It was like they were, and from their, you can actually understand it from the record company's perspective. It's like, you haven't given us time to promote the last thing you've done, and you already want to put something new out. I mean, it's not from their point of view. It's a non-starter. It won't work. But from his point of view, as a creative artist, who's got the right to tell him he can't put out his music when he wants to put out his music? So in that sense, it's an incredibly liberating thing. I think the whole thing about, we touched on it just now, that the disruptive influence of digital music and streaming, I think that's had a massive effect on music. The fact that it's taken away the physical object itself. But for better or worse, I mean, that's had such a massive effect on, and it clearly troubled the music industry greatly at the time. But I think that could, in the end, as I say, that could result in a lot more freedom for artists. They're not so tied down by I love albums. I love the physical nature of them. I love vinyl. If I'm going to buy an old album and it was out on vinyl originally, I'll buy it on vinyl if I can. But at the same time, it's sort of, it makes you a bit lighter of foot just to be able to release music digitally, and the instant access you and that. And it's sort of, I don't know. We'll see. Ask me next year, Tom.
Thanks again for joining the pod. You've been more than generous with your time. And once again, just want to recommend the new book, MusicQuake, The Most Disruptive Moments in Music. And
it's published by Francis Lincoln. I should say that.
And a shout out to Lewis, who teed up the chat. Thank you, Lewis. And also,
very much.
1001 Albums You Must Hear Before You Die, another fantastic book. Thanks again for all your time. Best of luck with your next project, and hopefully we'll chat to you again soon.
Been a real pleasure, Tom. Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. Cheers.
Bye.
The Groovy Guys are Tom Kennedy, Dan Lozier, Chris Palumbo, and Matt Carvalho. With your host, Tom Kennedy. Music by Dan Lozier, post-production by Matt, and album art by Chris.